The monitors in the gilded penthouse had been keeping a dead man's heartbeat for 5 months. Hillary was supposed to be invisible, just the girl in the black and white uniform who cleaned around him and pretended the silence didn't feel like drowning. She had no idea he could hear her singing. She had no idea he had been listening for nearly 3 weeks. And she had absolutely no idea that the night someone finally came to put a needle in his IV line and finish what the ambush started, the unconscious Korean warlord who hadn't moved a single muscle since April would grab her wrist, drag her into the dark, and whisper the exact words of her song back into her ear. It is 3 a.m. The penthouse suite is completely black. Not the soft, forgiving dark of a bedroom with curtains drawn, the absolute, suffocating darkness of a room where the power has been deliberately cut. Every monitor, every backup light, every green glowing digit that has been measuring Jiho's pulse for 5 unbroken months, gone, swallowed. The hissing ventilator falls silent for the first time since April, and the resulting quiet is so violent, so sudden, that Hillary feels it in her teeth. She is already on her feet before she understands why. Her body knows before her mind does. Her hand finds the cold brass neck of the bedside lamp, and her fingers curl around it like she has rehearsed this moment in a dream she cannot remember. Somewhere near the door, a shadow separates from the other shadows, purposeful, practiced, moving toward the bed with the quiet, terrible confidence of someone who has done this before. The syringe catches the moonlight for just one fraction of a second. Smash cut. 5 months earlier, the private east wing of the Harrington estate did not look like a sick room. It looked like a suite in a hotel that God himself might have stayed in if God had questionable taste in how his money was made. The floors were Italian marble, veined with pale gold and cold to the touch even through the thick Persian rugs that had been rolled out to muffle footsteps. The furniture was mahogany and iron dark. The drapes were velvet, floor to ceiling, swallowing the windows whole and filtering the glittering American skyline down to a smear of distant gold. A glass and chrome medical station had been installed against the far wall, precisely calibrated and maintained by a rotating team of private physicians who asked no questions and signed contracts that cost more than most people's homes. There was no nurse's station, no family waiting area, no cheerful artwork on the walls. There was only the room, and the man inside it, and the machines keeping him tethered to a life he could no longer access. The estate was registered under 3 different shell companies. The legitimate paper trail dissolved somewhere in the Cayman Islands and reappeared, impeccably laundered, as a philanthropy foundation headquartered in Virginia. In reality, every dollar that paid for the marble floors, the gold-framed mirrors, and the German-engineered monitors humming beside Jiho's bed had flowed through the iron hands of a Seoul-based crime syndicate, and the syndicate's money, like its violence, left no fingerprints. Outside the suite, the corridor was staffed around the clock by men who did not wear scrubs. Hillary Biden was 24 years old, and she had been carrying her family's debt since she was 17. Not her debt, her mother's debt, and her grandmother's before that, a crushing, generational weight that had been quietly accumulating interest in the background of her entire life, the way a hairline fracture accumulates pressure before the bone finally gives. She had tried 2 years of a nursing program before the tuition swallowed her whole. She had tried 3 jobs simultaneously before her body reminded her that it was still human. When the agency offered her the placement at Harrington Estate, triple the going rate, full discretion, 1 patient, restricted access, she read the NDA twice, felt the cold certainty that she was making a deal she did not fully understand, and signed it anyway. The woman who handed her the pen had not smiled. Hillary was assigned a black and white uniform pressed so crisply it felt like armor. She was given a laminated access card coded to a single corridor. She was given a room number and a set of instructions, and precisely nothing else. No history, no medical summary, no name. Until she walked through the door and read the chart herself. Park Ji-ho, age, 36, diagnosis, severe traumatic brain injury, diffuse axonal damage, medically induced coma secondary to multi-organ stress following gunshot trauma. Prognosis, guarded. The news, back when it had briefly mattered to American media, had called it a random shooting, a business executive caught in the wrong place. The men in the corridor outside the suite, the ones who never blinked, never smiled, and positioned themselves with the spatial awareness of soldiers, told a different, quieter story. Hillary folded the truth into the back of her mind, where she kept all the things she could not afford to react to, and she got to work. She had expected to feel afraid when she first saw him. She had steeled herself for it on the elevator ride, up the rational, self-preserving fear of a young woman walking into a room housing one of the most dangerous men on 2 continents. She had told herself, keep your eyes down, do your job, do not make this personal. What she had not prepared for was the grief. Jiho lay in the center of the vast, sterile room, and the sight of him even diminished, even stripped of everything that made powerful men powerful, carried a weight that pressed against her sternum. He was a striking man. Even the pale, hollowed quality that coma cast over a person could not entirely erase the architecture of him. The sharp, aristocratic line of his jaw, the dark hair that fell just slightly across his forehead, the cheekbones carved high and precise beneath his skin. His lips were set in an expression that was not quite peace and not quite pain, something suspended between the two, caught in a place language did not reach. But it was the tattoos that stopped her breath. They began at his collarbone and disappeared beneath the silk of his open pajama shirt, dark, intricate, traditional inkwork that crawled across his chest and wound down both arms in patterns so deliberate, so densely detailed, that they felt less like decoration and more like scripture, a history written directly onto his skin. She would learn, over the weeks to come, to read them the way you read a map, not for the names of places, but for the shape of the journey that led there. Every line was a decision. Every shadow was a consequence. 2 oxygen cannulas curved beneath his nose. A spiderweb of translucent tubes traced from his arms to the machines beside him. His chest rose and fell with mechanical precision, not the rhythm of a sleeping man, but the rhythm of a man whose body had outsourced the most basic task of survival to a German-engineered device. The Glasgow Coma Scale had rated him at a 3 for the duration of his stay and showed no intention of changing its mind. 3. The lowest survivable score. No eye-opening, no verbal response, no motor response. A living ghost, present and entirely unreachable. Outside the suite door stood a man named Baek Sung-min. He was enormous, the kind of man who occupied space the way a wall does, solid and absolute. He wore tailored suits that did nothing to disguise the breadth of his shoulders, and he stood with his hands clasped in front of him and his eyes on the corridor in a way that communicated, without a single word, that this hallway ended at his discretion. He had survived the ambush that put his boss in the bed. She would learn that later, and he moved through the estate with the contained, pressurized energy of a man who had been given one purpose and refused to fail at it. He did not speak to Hillary, the first day. He looked at her access card, looked at her face, looked at her access card again, and stepped aside. She understood the terms without being told. She was allowed in the room. She was not allowed to discuss the room. She was not allowed to ask questions about the man in the bed. And under no circumstances was she to allow anyone inside without his explicit clearance, regardless of what they claimed or who they said they worked for. She nodded, squared her shoulders, and walked into the silence. Her days developed a grammar of their own. 6 o'clock. Check the central line. Adjust the feeding tube. Chart the vitals. Turn him onto his side to prevent the quiet cruelties that stillness inflicts on a body. 8 o'clock. Warm water, soft cloth, careful hands working across his skin in the methodical, impersonal way that nurses are trained to maintain a deliberate emotional distance that protects both the caregiver and the patient. Noon. The physicians arrived, spoke to each other in low, clipped tones, and left without changing anything. Evening, repeat. Midnight, repeat. She was competent. She was thorough. She was professional. And the silence was going to make her lose her mind. It was not the silence of an empty room. An empty room simply holds quiet, neutral, unremarkable. This was something else. This was the silence of a man who should have been filling a space with sound, a voice, a breath, a laugh, an argument, the ordinary noise of a person existing and was not. It pressed against the walls of the suite. It pressed against the inside of her skull. The only sounds were the rhythmic hiss-click of the ventilator, the steady, monotonous beeping of the heart monitor, and the occasional distant murmur of the city through reinforced glass, and those sounds, far from softening the quiet, only sharpened it. By the end of the second week, she had started talking to herself just to hear a human voice in the room. By the end of the third, she had started talking to him. It started the way most desperate things start, without a plan, without permission, without fully understanding what she was doing until she was already doing it. It was a Thursday, the dead, gray weight of 2 a.m. She had finished her checks, and the suite was so quiet that she could hear her own heartbeat measuring out the minutes. She sat in the chair beside his bed, where she always sat when she needed to simply exist in the room without performing a task, and she looked at his face. The still, suspended, unreachable face of a man who was somewhere she could not follow. She opened her mouth, and she sang. Not loudly, not with any kind of performance behind it. She was not singing Times for Times hymn in the beginning, was not even entirely conscious that she had made a decision. She was singing the way you hum when you are alone in a car at night, the way a sound escapes before the mind can form an opinion about it. It was an old song her grandmother used to sing, something low and slow and saturated with the particular sorrow of women who had carried things they were never designed to carry alone. Her voice was soft. It moved through the silence the way light moves through still water, gently, completely, reaching the bottom without making a sound. She sang until the 3 a.m. check. She stopped, did her rounds, and did not acknowledge what had happened. The next night, she sang again. The songs changed as the weeks did. Sometimes she sang about her grandmother the way the old woman used to press both hands flat to the kitchen table when she laughed, like the joy was something physical she needed to brace against. Sometimes she sang about the debt, not its numbers, because those were too sharp and specific to be carried in a melody, but its shape. The way it had edited the boundaries of her entire life from the beginning, narrowing every room she walked into, every door she considered opening. She was not crying. She would have denied, firmly and without embarrassment, that she was crying. But she was pressing everything she was not permitted to say anywhere else into those songs, and the room received it without judgment. And something in that exchange between a girl with nothing to spare and a man who could not respond became, without either of them consenting to it, a kind of intimacy. It was the 5th week when she noticed it. She was singing something slow, her free hand resting lightly on the edge of the mattress near his arm, not touching him, just near, close enough to feel the heat his body still produced, that stubborn biological insistence on warmth even in a state that resembled nothing so much as its opposite. She was looking at his face, the way she often did when she sang, because his face was the most honest thing in the room, incapable of performance, incapable of pretense. She saw his jaw move. Not much, a fraction. The kind of movement that could be dismissed as a muscle reflex, a random electrical signal from damaged nerve endings, the sort of thing the neurologists would chalk up to synaptic noise without looking up from their charts. It was less than a twitch, less than a flinch. It was the absolute smallest unit of human response, barely visible, almost nothing. But it happened at the exact moment her voice went quiet between verses. She stopped. She sat completely still. She held her breath and watched his face with an intensity that made her eyes ache. The monitor continued its uncaring rhythm. The ventilator hissed. Nothing else moved. 30 seconds became a minute. A minute became 3. She exhaled slowly. She told herself it was the nerve damage. She told herself it was meaningless. She told herself that the human brain was extraordinary at finding patterns in randomness, especially when it was lonely and understimulated and working a midnight shift in a room that felt like the inside of a sealed jar. She picked up the song again, and she did not look away from his face for the rest of the hour. She noticed the changes the way you notice the pressure drop before a storm, not all at once, but as a gradual accumulation of wrongness. Sung Min was still at the door, but he looked different. The dark circles beneath his eyes had deepened to something bruised and permanent, and he held himself with the drawn, hyper-vigilant tension of a man who had not slept in a way that counted for a very long time. He paced the corridor now, where before he had been still. His hand hovered, almost unconsciously, near the inside of his jacket. Then the rotations started. New men appeared in the corridor. Not Sung Min's men, she could tell the difference without being able to articulate exactly how. These men had eyes that were colder and less careful. They leaned against the walls instead of standing at attention. They smoked in the stairwell directly against the estate's own posted rules, and when Hillary passed them, they did not step aside. They watched her the way men watch something they have not yet decided the value of. And they watched the door to Jiho's suite with an expression she recognized, after some turning it over in her mind late at night, as hunger. Not the hunger of men who cared about the person inside the room. The hunger of men who were calculating what the room would be worth once it was empty. Hillary pressed her access card to the suite's sensor, slipped inside, and closed the door behind her with the soft, careful precision she always used, as though a sound too loud might disturb something she had not yet found the name for. She set her supplies on the cart. She moved to his bedside. She looked at Park Ji-ho's face, still, suspended, precisely where she had left him, and she felt, for the first time, something that was not clinical and was not professional and was not safe. She felt afraid for him. Not of him. Not because of what the whispers in the corridor said he was, or what the tattoos mapped across his chest confirmed. Afraid times for times him the specific, sharp-edged fear of a person watching something precious sit too close to the edge of a table, unable to reach it in time. She pulled the chair close. She sat. She began, very softly, to sing. Outside the door, the empire was fracturing. Inside the room, the man who ran it was fighting his way back from a darkness that no one in the world knew he was already escaping one note at a time, using her voice as his only compass. This is where it began. That pull you're feeling right now, trust it. This story is only just beginning, and where it goes will stay with you long after it ends. Jiho has been lying in that room for 5 months, motionless, unreachable. And Hillary has no idea what she has already set in motion simply by walking through that door. Subscribe right now and hit the notification bell, because Chapter 2 drops next, and you cannot afford to miss what happens in the dark. Leave a comment below. Tell us, are you already hooked? Or are you still pretending you can walk away from this one? You can't. We both know it. Stay in the shadows. The story continues. She had a system. And the system was the only thing keeping her sane. 6:45 every morning, Hillary arrived before the day shift physicians made their rounds. She set her cart outside the door, pressed her card to the panel, and stepped inside before the suite could breathe on her, before the weight of the room could settle onto her shoulders the way it always did when she had been away from it for more than a few hours. She had learned, in the weeks since her assignment began, that the room had a personality, a mood, that it held the particular atmosphere of a place where something enormous and unresolved was simply waiting, suspended in amber, for the world to catch up to it. She moved through her routine with the kind of focused quiet that comes not from peace, but from discipline. She checked the central line first, running gloved fingers along the translucent tubing, checking for air or discoloration. Her dark eyes sharp and methodical beneath the soft overhead light. She adjusted the feeding tube. She noted the vitals on the chart: temperature, blood pressure, oxygen saturation numbers that had not changed meaningfully in weeks, numbers that the physicians looked at with the careful, practiced blankness of people who had stopped expecting them to. Then she prepared the basin. Warm water. Not hot, she had learned the precise temperature that would not shock his nervous system, had calibrated it by pressing the inside of her own wrist to the surface until it felt like the right kind of warmth. Soft cloth. She worked with an efficiency that had, somewhere in the past several weeks, quietly become something more deliberate than clinical. She folded the cloth twice, pressed it gently to his forearm, the one where the tattoos began just above the elbow, a dark phoenix with wings spread mid-descent, its feathers so finely inked they looked like something between art and scripture. She moved the cloth across his skin with slow, even strokes. The silence watched her do it. That was how she had come to think of the quiet in this room, not as an absence of sound, but as a presence of its own. Something with intention. It pressed against her temples in the deep middle of her shifts, and it gathered in the corners of the ceiling and along the heavy velvet drapes, and it sat at the foot of his bed like a patient, enormous thing that had been waiting for something she had not yet agreed to give. By week 4, she had started talking to it. By week 5, she was talking to him, and on a night she could not exactly remember, a wet, moonless night, somewhere in the long blur of November, she had opened her mouth to speak, and what came out instead was a song. It was not a grand voice. She had never thought of herself that way, had never stood in front of a mirror and performed for herself, never filled a room with intention, but it was a real voice. It was warm, low, a little rough at the edges in the way that voices carrying real weight tend to be. It moved through the room like something alive, filling the corners the silence had claimed, pressing gently against the reinforced glass of the windows, curling around the machines and their cold mechanical rhythms. She sang about her grandmother's kitchen on Sunday mornings. She sang about the particular quality of the light in the apartment where she had grown up, thin winter light, coming in sideways through a window that faced another building. Not beautiful, but hers. She sang about the dead without singing about the dead, about the specific, bone-deep exhaustion of carrying something you did not choose and cannot put down. About the mathematics of sacrifice. About all the versions of herself she had set aside in rooms smaller than this one to make space for survival. She believed, completely and without question, that she was singing to a ghost. She was wrong. He heard everything. He had been hearing everything for 19 days. Park Ji-ho existed in a condition that had no adequate language. He was not asleep. He was not unconscious. His mind had surfaced from the deepest damage weeks ago, dragged itself back from the absolute black of post-injury shutdown through sheer, grinding force of will, and found itself imprisoned inside a body that had not yet received the message. His nervous system was rebuilding itself in the dark, nerve by agonizing nerve, and in the meantime his body lay still, and the world moved around him as though he were already gone, and he could not make a single sound. He heard the physicians. He heard Sungmin's boots on the marble corridor. He heard and catalogued with cold, burning precision every word that had been spoken beside his bed by men who believed he was no longer capable of listening. And he heard her. The first time her voice filled the room, something in him, something that had been gripping the inside of his own skull with both hands for 19 days, holding itself away from the edge, went very still. Not the stillness of his body. His body had no choice but stillness. This was something else. The stillness of a thing that has found its anchor. He felt the warmth of the cloth against his forearm. He felt her move it in slow, careful strokes across the phoenix tattoo he had received at 22 years old, 3 days after his first kill, in a basement in Busan that smelled of salt water and copper. Nobody had ever touched it gently. The sensation moved through the thin, rebuilding pathways of his nervous system like electricity through water, diffuse, overwhelming, impossible to ignore. His jaw tightened. A fraction. The smallest possible fraction. She did not stop singing. He did not know her name then. He knew the specific warmth of her hands and the low, aching honesty of her voice and the way she pressed everything she refused to say out loud into her music, her pain, made audible, offered freely to an empty room. He knew that when she sang, the darkness inside his skull became something he could bear, that her voice was the only sound in the suite that was not measuring his failure to respond. He began, very deliberately, to count the hours until she returned. He began, with everything left inside him, to fight. Not for the Empire. Not for the syndicate bleeding out beyond the fortified walls of this room. Not for Taejin, or the Seoul territories, or the trans-Pacific routes that were already being quietly partitioned by men who had decided he was gone. He fought for the sound of her voice in the dark. He fought because she sang like she was saving herself. And somewhere in the locked, paralyzed architecture of his chest, something responded to that with a ferocity that frightened him, and Park Ji-ho had not been frightened of anything in a very long time. The monitor kept its steady, uncaring rhythm. The room kept its silence, and Hillary Biden sat in her chair in the amber glow of the bedside lamp, her dark hands folded in her lap, her head slightly bowed, and she sang completely unaware that the man she believed she was singing to was listening with every cell he had left, listening, and slowly, agonizingly, finding his way back to her. The first sign was the cigarette smoke. Hillary smelled it before the door opened, a thin, acrid ribbon threading beneath the gap in the reinforced steel frame, curling into the sterile air of the suite like something that did not belong and knew it. She was at the window, adjusting the drapes, her dark fingers smoothing a fold in the heavy velvet when the panel beeped and the door swung wide, and the man who walked in carried that smell on him the way some men carry entitlement completely unconsciously, as though the world had always been expected to accommodate it. He was not tall, but he entered tall. That was the only way to describe it. Kwon Tae-jin moved through space with the particular arrogance of a man who had spent years standing just close enough to real power to mistake the proximity for possession. He wore a charcoal suit that had been cut for someone slightly more important than he currently was, and his shoes, Italian, dark, aggressively polished, struck the marble floor with a sharp, deliberate rhythm, as though each footfall were a small announcement. He did not look at Hillary. Not a glance. Not an acknowledgement. She was the furniture, and the furniture did not require eye contact. He walked past her the way men like him always walk past women like her through her, essentially. The way you walk through a door that has already been opened for you. She tightened her grip on the drape fabric, felt the velvet compress between her fingers, and said nothing. She turned back to the window. She kept her face arranged in the careful, professional neutrality she had perfected in the weeks since her arrival, the expression that communicated availability without invitation, presence without opinion. She watched him in the glass's reflection. Tae-jin approached the bed. He stood at the foot of it, looking down at Ji-ho with an expression that Hillary had no immediate name for, something between assessment and contempt, the look of a man examining a property dispute that had recently resolved in his favor. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a cigarette that he did not light, simply rolling it between his fingers the way men handle things they intend to destroy but have not yet decided when. "Still here," he said, in English. To no one in particular, or perhaps to Ji-ho himself, the comment delivered with the casual cruelty of a man who no longer feared the person he was addressing. Still breathing. He tilted his head slightly. Impressive. Pointless, but impressive. The room did not respond. Hillary did not respond. Inside the bed, behind the motionless architecture of his face, Park Ji-ho heard every syllable, and something in the deepest chamber of his chest went incandescent with rage, a rage so controlled, so dense that it had no external expression whatsoever. He burned. He burned with the particular fury of a man who is powerful enough to know exactly what he would do if his body would simply cooperate, and whose body continues, with maddening indifference, to refuse. Tae-jin began to speak, quietly, his voice dropping to the register of a man accustomed to saying things that cannot be recorded, in rooms he has already checked for listening devices. He spoke about the Busan port contracts. He spoke about the 3 American distributors who had already been quietly redirected. He described, with the calm fluency of a man who had rehearsed this moment for months, the precise architecture of a betrayal so thorough, so methodically constructed, that it could only have been built by someone with intimate access to every layer of the empire. He spoke to Ji-ho's motionless body, the way a usurper speaks over a coffin, not to address the dead, but to confirm, out loud, that the transfer of power is complete. Hillary kept her back turned. She smoothed the drape again. She adjusted a thing that did not need adjusting. And she listened, not because she wanted to, but because there was nowhere else in the room to be. And the man behind her had not given her permission to leave, had not acknowledged she was capable of leaving, had simply proceeded as though her presence were as irrelevant as the machines. Something cold moved through her. Not fear, exactly. Fear she was accustomed to fear was a small, manageable animal that lived in her chest and responded to logic. What she felt now was older than fear. It was the primal recognition of a predator in the room, and the secondary, deeply inconvenient recognition that the predator was standing over something she had, without entirely realizing it, begun to consider hers. She turned. She did not speak. She moved to the far side of the bed, picked up the chart, and began writing with the slow, unhurried precision of someone performing a task so routine it requires no explanation. But she positioned herself between Tae-jin and the IV stand, and her dark eyes moved once briefly, sharply to Ji-ho's face, still, unmoving, the monitors humming their steady, uncaring rhythm. Tae-jin finished. He straightened his cuffs. He looked at Ji-ho one final time with that assessing, proprietary expression, and then he turned and walked back across the marble floor, his shoes marking each step with that same sharp, self-satisfied report. At the door, he paused. He looked at Hillary, truly looked at her, for the first and only time since entering the room. His gaze moved across her with the efficiency of a man cataloging a detail of minor administrative relevance. "Keep him clean," he said, and left. The door sealed behind him. The cigarette smell lingered. Hillary stood very still. Her pen had stopped moving. Her knuckles, where her hand wrapped around the bed rail, had gone pale against her dark skin, a grip she had not consciously applied and could not immediately release. She stared at Ji-ho's face. That carved, motionless, unreachable face, the jaw set, the dark lashes still against his cheekbones, the tattoos spreading across his chest in their dense, cryptic language of a life built entirely on consequence. "I don't know if you heard that," she said quietly. Her voice was steady. "It cost her." She picked up the warm cloth. She pressed it gently to the inside of his wrist, below the cuff of the IV line, where the skin was thinner and the pulse faint, present, stubborn, moved against her fingertips like a secret. "But I did," she said, and she did not move her hand away. She heard about the explosion the way she heard about most things in that estate, second-hand, in fragments, from conversations that were not meant for her ears. It was the Tuesday morning guard rotation. Two of Tae-jin's newer men were speaking in the corridor outside the suite door, their voices low, but not low enough, carrying through the reinforced panel in the particular way that sound travels when people believe themselves unobserved. Hillary was inside, changing the IV fluid bag, her movements quiet and practiced, her attention outwardly fixed entirely on the task in front of her. But her ears had developed, over weeks of working in that estate, the same careful, adaptive quality as the rest of her. She had learned to hear what was not being said to her. The front company, the warehouse off the port road. Fire crews had taken 4 hours to bring it down. Nothing left. No survivors confirmed. But one name kept surfacing in the low, clipped exchange outside the door, the same name, passed between the men with a brevity that carried the specific weight of something being closed rather than discussed. Jin-woo. She did not know who Jin-woo was. She had heard the name once before, spoken by Sung-min in a tone that suggested the kind of loyalty that does not negotiate the name of a man the bodyguard considered an extension of his own function. She filed it quietly beside everything else she was not supposed to know, and she finished changing the IV bag, and she smoothed the edge of the tape against Ji-ho's inner arm with a thumb that was perfectly, deliberately steady. That night, she thought about it while she sang. She did not let it change the song. The discovery happened at 11:47 on a Thursday, in the linen corridor off the east service wing. It was a part of the estate Hillary had come to know the way she knew all utility spaces practically, without sentimentality. The service corridors existed behind the walls of the main house in a parallel architecture that was older than the renovations, its ceilings lower, its floors bare concrete rather than marble, lit by fluorescent strips that hummed with the faint, persistent energy of something running on a reduced budget. This was the infrastructure of the invisible, the passageways through which things like clean sheets and fresh towels and meal trays moved without disturbing the aesthetic of the rooms they served. She was gathering the soiled linen from the collection trolley outside the sweet anteroom, bundling the sheets with the efficiency of someone performing a task for the fourth consecutive week, when she felt it. Not saw it first. Felt it a dampness in the cotton that was distinct from the sweat or the saline residue she had learned to expect. She held the bundle up to the fluorescent light, turning it, and the smear that appeared against the white was unmistakable, fresh, still with that particular dark rust quality that blood carries in its first hours before it oxidizes to brown, a diagonal stroke, like something pressed with the outside of a fist. She did not drop the linen. Her hands were steadier than she had any right to expect. She pressed into the bundle further, her fingers working carefully through the folds, and she found the note tucked between two layers of sheet, a torn piece of paper, folded once, its edges stiff and dark where the blood had soaked through from the other side. She opened it slowly. The handwriting was dense and urgent. The characters, a mix of Korean and English, pressed deep into the paper as though written under enormous physical strain. East Corridor, sublevel, wine room, not dead, do not tell anyone. Below it, two characters in Korean she could not read, and a rough diagram that was unmistakably a map of the estate's subterranean layout. Hillary stood in the humming fluorescent corridor for exactly 10 seconds. She was giving herself those 10 seconds consciously, with the clarity of someone who has encountered a decision so significant that they can feel the precise weight of it. She could fold the note back into the linen. She could hand the bundle to the collection service as though she had found nothing. She could walk back upstairs to the suite and sit in her chair and sing and pretend the world beneath this building did not exist. She thought about Tae-jin's shoes on the marble floor, the proprietary satisfaction in his voice. She thought about Jiho's pulse beneath her fingertips, faint, present, stubborn. She put the note in her pocket. The sub-level access was a door at the end of the service corridor that had no panel, only a physical key, and the key was hanging on a hook behind the linen cart exactly where the diagram indicated it would be. The fact that someone had known to leave it there, and leave it for her specifically, was a thought she did not allow herself to fully process until later. She unlocked the door and went down. The temperature dropped immediately. The stairwell was unlit, absolute dark, the kind that presses physically against the eyes, and she navigated it by trailing her left hand along the damp concrete wall, her right hand gripping her phone for its narrow flashlight beam. The metallic smell hit her halfway down, blood, older than what had been on the sheets, and beneath it the cool, mineral scent of stone and aged wood, and a darkness that had not been disturbed in some time. The corridor at the bottom was narrow. Her shoulders nearly touched both walls. She moved through it the way she moved through everything in that estate, with the quiet, deliberate economy of a woman who had learned that the space between being seen and being invisible was exactly the width of her own stillness. Her heartbeat was loud in her ears. She registered it the way she registered the cold seeping through her uniform, the rough concrete beneath her shoes as data, as something to work around rather than surrender to. The wine room was at the end, a heavy oak door with no lock, standing fractionally ajar. She pushed it open. The man on the floor was enormous, even collapsed against the base of the wine racks, one arm braced against a rack of bottles to hold himself partially upright. He occupied the space the way a felled tree occupies a forest floor. His shirt was dark, with blood from a wound at his side that had been packed with what appeared to be torn linen and sheer determination. His face was broad and severe and deeply, extravagantly exhausted. But his eyes, when they found hers in the thin beam of her flashlight, were absolutely, entirely alert. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, in English that carried the precise, careful quality of a second language deployed under pressure, he said, "You are the one who sings to him." It was not a question. Hillary looked at the wound. She looked at the wine racks. She looked at the man's hands, massive, bloodied. A ring on the right hand with a crest she did not recognize. And then she looked back at his face with the expression of a woman who has made a decision she will not be revisiting. "Tell me what you need," she said. His name was Jinwoo, and he had been waiting in the dark for 6 days. He told her this without self-pity, in the flat, factual tone of a man for whom suffering was simply a condition to be managed rather than acknowledged. He told her other things too, in careful, rationed portions, the way a man distributes the last of his water when he cannot be certain of the next source. He told her that the explosion had been deliberate, that Tae-jin had arranged it with the same meticulous, bloodless efficiency with which he had arranged everything else, the guard rotations, the physician contracts, the quiet redirection of the syndicate's American assets into accounts that bore no traceable connection to the man lying upstairs in the silk-sheeted bed. He told her that Tae-jin had not simply decided to take the empire. He had been building the architecture of this moment for 8 months. Hillary listened. She was crouched on the cold concrete floor of the wine cellar, her uniform already ruined at the knees. Working with the supplies she had thought to pull from her bag before descending, she always carried a small trauma kit, a habit formed in nursing school that the agency had never asked about and she had never stopped maintaining. Her dark hands moved across Jinwoo's wound with the competent, unsentimental focus of someone who had made the decision to help and had no patience for anything that delayed it. The gash was deep, but survivable. He had kept it clean enough. He had survived worse, she suspected. From the topography of old scarring visible beneath his torn shirt, a man whose body was a detailed record of every conflict it had outlasted. "You are not afraid," Jinwoo observed, watching her work. "I am," she said without looking up. "I'm just not letting it drive." Something shifted in his expression, not softness exactly, but a recalibration, a reassessment. He was quiet for a moment, his breath controlled and deliberate against the pain of her hands pressing gauze to his side. And then he said, "He trusted no one in this house, before." A pause. "But he trusted your voice." Her hands stilled for just a fraction of a second. Then she continued working. "He can hear you," Jinwoo said. "He has been able to hear for some time." The wine cellar was very quiet. The bottles ranked along their dark wooden shelves held their decades-old silences, indifferent, and the damp concrete breathed its cold mineral smell around them both. And Hillary sat with what Jinwoo had just told her pressing against the inside of her chest like something trying to find a way out. She thought about every word she had poured into that room, every fragment of sorrow she had pressed into her songs, believing it would dissolve into the air. Every night she had sat in the amber light beside his bed and offered the most unguarded parts of herself to what she believed was simply the mercy of an empty room. She absorbed this. She filed it in the same place she filed everything else she could not afford to react to in the moment. "What do you need from me?" she said. Jinwoo held her gaze, the direct, measuring gaze of a man who is deciding how much of the truth to trust someone with, and has concluded that the answer is all of it. He told her simply, he needed eyes on the top floor. He needed to know Tae-jin's movements, the guard rotations outside the suite, the precise timing of the physician's visits. He needed someone who could move through the estate without drawing attention, someone Tae-jin had already categorized as irrelevant, and therefore left entirely unmonitored. He needed the girl who was already invisible. "Sung-min is alive?" Jinwoo said, his voice dropping further. "Tae-jin's men believe he is somewhere in the city. He is not." He did not elaborate, and Hillary did not ask. "They will send someone for the boss," he continued, the words carrying the particular gravity of a fact that had already been decided somewhere in a room Hillary was never in, by men she was never meant to know existed. not to observe, not to verify, to finish what the ambush began. And when they do, I need to be ready. I need you to make sure nothing changes upstairs. Nothing. His routine, your presence, your singing. He paused. Everything exactly as it has been. How did you get the note into the laundry? She asked. Jinwoo glanced toward the far wall of the cellar, the old stone wall behind the last wine rack, where a narrow access panel sat level with the floor. The estate has a laundry chute that runs from the sub-level to every floor. I had enough left in me for one trip to the access panel. He said this without pride. It was simply a fact about what the body will do when it has no acceptable alternative. Hillary stood. She smoothed her uniform with both hands, the straightening of herself, before returning to the world that expected her to be composed. She looked at Jinwoo for a long moment, at the wound she had dressed, at the ring on his right hand, at the absolute, undeviating loyalty in his face, not to her, but to the man upstairs, a loyalty so complete it had survived an explosion and 6 days in a wine cellar without dimming by a single degree. She understood that kind of devotion. She did not examine why. I'll be back tomorrow night, she said. Same time. She left him in the dark, and she climbed back up through the subterranean corridor with the cold concrete wall under her fingertips and everything she now knew resettling itself around her shoulders. By the time she reached the suite door and pressed her card to the panel, she had arranged her face into perfect neutrality. She had done this before, carried invisible things across a threshold, while appearing to carry nothing. She was very good at it, but she was not prepared for how the room felt when she walked back into it. He was exactly as she had left him. Of course he was. The monitors hummed. The ventilator maintained its rhythm. The amber light of the bedside lamp fell across his face and his tattooed chest and the spider web of tubes, all of it unchanged, all of it suspended in the amber of its own terrible stasis, except that now she knew he was in there. She crossed the room. She sat in her chair. She looked at his face, truly looked, the way she had unconsciously avoided doing since Jinwoo's words had rearranged everything, and she felt the ground shift beneath her with a quiet, seismic certainty. She reached out. Her fingers found his cheek, the flat plane of it beneath her palm, the warmth that his body still faithfully produced. She felt him beneath her touch, present, contained, enduring, and her hand trembled. Once, before she stilled it. Then she opened her mouth, and she sang. But this time, the melody carried something new inside it, something laced beneath the sorrow like a current beneath still water. Not a lament, not a comfort. A plea pressed into the music so deeply that only someone listening with more than just their ears could have found it. "Wake up," the song said, beneath every word she sang aloud. "Please, wake up. Because something is coming, and I cannot stop it alone. And I have run out of reasons to pretend I don't need you to." The monitor kept its rhythm. His jaw tightened barely, impossibly in the dark. The power died at 3 o'clock exactly. Not a flicker, not the gradual dimming of a fault or a surge. A clean, surgical severance, the kind that could only be deliberate. One moment the suite existed in its amber vigil of monitor light and bedside lamp warmth, and the next there was nothing. Absolute dark. The ventilator's rhythm stopped mid-cycle, and the abrupt, total silence that followed was so complete it had a physical texture it pressed against Hillary's skin like cold water. She was already awake. She had not slept during a shift in 11 days. She sat in her chair with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap. And in the darkness, she could feel her own pulse in her throat with a clarity that told her the thing Jinwoo had warned her about was no longer approaching. It was here. She heard the door. Not the beep of the panel was dead. The electronic lock disengaged by the same precise cut that had killed everything else. Just the soft, pressurized exhale of the seal releasing, and then the near-silent rotation of the handle, executed with the particular, practiced care of someone who had done this in the dark before and understood that sound was the only thing that could betray them now. Hillary did not move. She did not breathe. The shadow entered. It separated itself from the darkness of the corridor and became a different quality of dark, inside the room, purposeful, directional, moving with the fluid. Unhurried confidence of a man who has been told the room contains nothing dangerous. A medical technician's ID badge caught the thin blade of moonlight from the gap in the drapes. His hands were gloved. In his right hand, the syringe caught the light for one single, damning fraction of a second, the barrel filled with something clear and untraceable and absolute, angled precisely toward the central IV line. Hillary's hand found the lamp. She did not think. The body thinks faster than the mind in moments like this, faster than fear, faster than consequence. Her fingers closed around the brass neck, and she stood in one motion, and she threw it with every ounce of force her arm possessed. The lamp struck the operative across the temple with a sound like a door slamming. He staggered. The syringe did not fall. His grip tightened on it reflexively, the grip of trained muscle memory, and he turned toward her with the focused, emotionless adjustment of a man rerouting to a secondary problem. He never reached her. The arm that came out from beneath the silk sheets was not the arm of a man who had been motionless for 5 months. It was the arm of something that had been compressed, contained, coiled under pressure for longer than should have been survivable, and it moved with a violence so sudden and so exact that it did not seem possible that it had originated from that bed, from that body, from the man the entire syndicate had written off as a breathing ghost. Jiho's hand closed around the operative's wrist. The crack of bone was not loud. That was the part Hillary would return to, later. In the quiet of the days that followed, how quiet it was. A single, dense, horrible sound, contained and immediate. And then the operative's body folded around it the way bodies fold around irreversible pain. His breath, leaving him in a compressed, voiceless rush. Jiho's grip did not loosen. His arm moved with the economical, surgical precision of a man who had rehearsed this particular geometry in the dark theater of his own paralyzed mind every single day for weeks. Angle, pressure, rotation, and he drove the operative's own wrist backward, turning the syringe in the man's locked fist, and pressed the needle into the side of the man's neck with a slow, deliberate force that was somehow more terrifying than speed would have been. The operative went down without a sound. The room returned to its stillness, and then Park Ji-ho sat up. It was not the movement of a recovered man. It was the movement of a man dragging himself back from a very long way away through pure, grinding refusal, his jaw set, the tendons in his neck rigid, every muscle in his body engaged in the enormous, shaking effort of overriding 5 months of enforced stillness. The tubes pulled. He reached up with deliberate hands and removed them, one by one, with the careful precision of someone who has spent a great deal of time thinking about exactly this sequence of actions. Hillary had not moved. She stood in the dark, her chest heaving, her dark skin damp with the cold sweat of adrenaline, and she watched him with an expression that carried too many things at once for any single word to hold them. He turned his head, and he found her in the dark. Even now, depleted, trembling faintly with the effort of his own resurrection, his eyes were the most alert thing she had ever seen in a human face. Dark and deep and burning with a controlled, absolute intensity that made the darkness between them feel pressurized. He raised one hand. Not a command, a reach. He held it open in the space between them. She crossed the room. She did not decide to. Her body simply moved toward his, the way it had been quietly, incrementally moving toward him for 5 months without her permission. She took his hand. His fingers closed around hers carefully, with a gentleness that was entirely at odds with what those same hands had done 30 seconds prior, and he drew her down into the narrow shadow beside the bed, pressing her back against the cold wall and curving himself, still shaking, still assembling himself breath by breath from the ruins of 5 months, around her. His mouth found her ear, and in a voice destroyed by months of disuse, graveled and rough and barely more than breath, he sang. The exact verse she had sung to him on a wet November night when she believed she was alone. Every note, every word. delivered back to her in the dark with a precision that could only have come from someone who had memorized it the way drowning men memorize the surface. Hillary stopped breathing. His chest pressed against her back, still trembling faintly, and the resonance of his voice moved through the contact point of their bodies like a low, private frequency, something she felt more than heard. His lips were close enough that she could feel the warmth of each syllable against the curve of her ear, and the song, her song, returned to her from the dark place he had been, undid something in her chest that she had not known was held together. His voice broke on the final note, not from emotion, from the sheer physical cost of using it at all. He exhaled slowly against her temple, and his hand, still wrapped around hers, pressed with a quiet, desperate strength that communicated everything he did not yet have the voice to say. "I heard you," that grip said. "Every note, every night. I heard all of it." The dead monitor said nothing. The city glittered cold and indifferent beyond the reinforced glass. And in the total dark of the most dangerous room in the Harrington estate, the most feared man in the soul underworld held the girl who had sung him back to life, and neither of them moved. Outside the door, the Empire was already burning. Inside the room, something else entirely had just begun. "We need to call someone," Hillary said. "A doctor, an ambulance, someone." No, one word, delivered in a voice still raw from disuse, but carrying a quiet, absolute authority that closed the conversation the way a vault door closes not violently, but with the finality of something engineered to hold. His hand found her wrist in the dark, his fingers circling the bone with a grip that was equal parts command and plea, and she felt the tremor running through him, the fine, uncontrollable shaking of a body attempting to sustain a level of function it was not yet rebuilt to maintain. She looked at him. In the thin moonlight threading through the gap in the drapes, his face was stripped of everything: performance, no armor, no calculation, nothing but the naked, ferocious effort of a man holding himself together through sheer refusal to come apart. The tattoos across his chest rose and fell with each labored breath. His jaw was set. His dark eyes were completely, dangerously lucid. "They are all compromised," he said. Each word cost him something visible. Every physician on this floor, every guard rotation below the 4th level. "If you make a call from this room, Taejin will know I am awake before the line connects." He paused, gathering breath like a resource being carefully rationed. "And then we will both be dead before morning." She looked at his hand around her wrist. She looked at his face. She did not reach for her phone. "Tell me what to do," she said. The backup power restored itself 11 minutes after the cut. Taejin's men had designed it that way. A clean window followed by a return to normal readings, so that when the morning physicians arrived, the monitors would show nothing more alarming than an unremarkable night. Ji-ho had been counting on exactly that. Working in the dark with a man who could barely stand should have felt impossible. Instead, it felt like something she had been preparing for without knowing it. Every quiet, careful movement she had developed over 5 months of tending to him in that room, suddenly repurposed, the same steady hands and the same deliberate economy of motion applied to an entirely different kind of emergency. He leaned on her, and she took his weight without comment. He was heavier than she had imagined, not the weight of deadness, but the density of a body built over decades for a life that demanded it be structurally uncompromising. His arm across her shoulders pressed with a heat that was distinct from fever, something metabolic, something alive. The warmth of a system working furiously hard to catch up with the demands being placed on it. She could feel his breathing against her temple. Slow, controlled, deliberate, the breathing of a man managing pain by refusing to acknowledge it. "The body," he said quietly. "Under the bed." It was the most surreal sentence anyone had ever said to her. She registered this from a great, calm distance, and then she helped him do it. She had thought, once, that there were things she would not be capable of. She filed that belief beside everything else she had been wrong about since walking into this room, and she kept moving. They worked in near silence, communicating in the compressed, efficient shorthand of two people operating under shared urgency, he directed. She executed where his strength failed him. The operative was heavier than expected, and the marble floor offered no friction, and the entire operation unfolded in a darkness so complete that she navigated it by touch and spatial memory. The geography of this room lived inside her body after 5 months of moving through it in every condition of light. Exhaustion. When the body was concealed, Jiho disabled the ventilator's alarm panel with 4 precise keystrokes before the power fully restored. He had spent 5 months listening to every technician who had ever serviced the machine 3 feet from his head. He knew its architecture, the way men know the things that have kept them alive. He sank against the bed frame for a moment, his head bowed, breath escaping in a controlled exhale that he clearly did not want her to hear as anything other than operational. She heard it anyway. She crouched beside him without asking. She put one hand flat against his back, not the clinical touch of the caregiver she had been, but the different, more complicated touch of someone who has run out of the particular kind of distance that professional roles provide. She felt him register it, the almost imperceptible shift in his posture, a fraction of his held tension releasing beneath her palm. "The leads," he said. He did not move away from her hand. She understood. She retrieved the heart monitor leads from where they had detached during the struggle and, following his quiet, precise instructions, connected them to the body beneath the bed. The monitor resumed its rhythm steady, uncaring, exactly as it had sounded for 5 months. The room sounded, to anyone outside its walls, entirely unchanged. Jiho pushed himself upright. She rose with him, her hand still at his back, steadying without being asked. He turned to look at her, and for a moment they were very close. The dark and the urgency and the accumulated weight of everything compressing the space between their bodies to something that neither of them had agreed to and neither of them was willing to examine in the dark. His eyes moved across her face with a deliberateness that had nothing to do with the tactical situation and everything to do with the 5 months he had spent learning her by sound alone, now finally, irreversibly resolved into sight. He reached up. His thumb, careful, brief, devastating, crossed her cheekbone once. The touch was gone before she could respond to it. "The curtains," he said quietly. "I will be behind them." He moved toward the heavy velvet drapes. He stopped. "The bed," he said. "It needs to look occupied." Hillary understood without being asked. She arranged the pillows beneath the silk sheets with the practiced hands of someone who had turned that body 1,000 times, shaping absence into the convincing silhouette of presence. When she finished, the bed looked precisely as it always had, undisturbed, inhabited. Jiho drew the drapes aside just enough to fold himself into the darkness behind their fall, becoming once again deliberately, strategically invisible. She watched the curtains settle, smooth, undisturbed. He was already gone, as completely as though the dark had accepted him back as its own. The room looked exactly as it always had. Hillary stood alone in the restored amber light. She was trembling a fine, deep tremor that had nothing to do with cold and everything to do with the compound pressure of the last 40 minutes, bearing down on a nervous system that had been running on vigilance and denial for 11 consecutive days. She walked to her chair. She sat. She looked at the bed, the leads running beneath it to their grim, necessary purpose. The silk sheets shaped into their practiced deception. The room performing its 5-month lie with flawless indifference. And she thought about the man standing 12 feet away in the dark, listening. She opened her mouth. The sound that came out was barely a song, at first more breath than melody, her voice stripped down to its foundations by everything her body was currently managing. But she held it. She steadied it with the iron-willed composure of a woman who had learned that falling apart was a luxury the present moment could not afford. The melody rose, thin and trembling and achingly, unmistakably real. Behind the curtain, in the absolute dark, she heard nothing. Not a breath, not a shift of fabric, nothing. But she knew he was listening. She had always known he was listening. And so she sang into the waiting dark, into the silence behind the velvet, into the space between what they were and everything they had not yet become, and she did not stop. Taejin arrived at 4:17 in the morning, and he arrived the way he always arrived, like a man who had already decided how the room would receive him. He came with 3 of his men, which told Hillary everything about his confidence and nothing about his intelligence. 3 men for a verification. 3 men to witness the moment a throne formally changed hands. She heard them in the corridor before the door opened, the familiar, sharp report of his shoes on the marble. Unhurried, almost leisurely, the footsteps of a man who believed the most dangerous variables in his equation had already been resolved. Hillary did not stop singing. Her voice had steadied over the past hour into something that no longer trembled. She sat in her chair, with her dark hands folded in her lap, and her spine precisely vertical, and her eyes fixed on the bed, a woman performing a routine task in an unremarkable room, giving nothing away, costing herself everything to hold the line. The door opened. Taejin entered. His eyes swept the suite with the brisk, proprietary efficiency of a man taking inventory of something that now belonged to him. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm. The silk sheets held their careful shape. The room was dim and quiet and entirely, convincingly normal. His mouth curved. "Still singing," he said, to no one in particular. The same tone he always used when he acknowledged her adjacent to acknowledgement, not quite arriving at it. He moved toward the bed without looking at her again, his hands in his pockets, his posture carrying the loose, satisfied ease of conclusion. He looked down at the silhouette beneath the silk sheets, and something moved across his face, not grief, not guilt, nothing so human as either. Satisfaction, pure and clean and utterly devoid of complexity. "Dispose of her," he said. He said it the way you say, "Times clear the table, times or times close the blinds, times a domestic instruction, frictionless, requiring no particular emphasis." One of his men separated from the group and moved toward Hillary's chair. The deadbolts fired. Every lock in the suite engaged simultaneously a sound like 4 consecutive hammer strikes against the oak of the doors, each bolt driving home with a finality that sealed the room as completely as a vault. The electronic system had been rerouted. Taejin's access card, and every card coded to his clearance level, had been quietly deauthorized from a terminal in the subterranean corridor 6 hours ago by a man with a suppressed weapon and very specific instructions. The suite had become a trap, and its architect stepped out of the dark. Ji-ho emerged from behind the velvet curtains with the slow, deliberate patience of a man who has been waiting for exactly this moment and intends to take his time with it. He was not rushing. He did not need to. He moved to the center of the room and stopped, and the quality of his stillness reached every corner before his voice did not the stillness of absence, but the absolute, concentrated stillness of a man in complete command of the space he occupies. The temperature seemed to drop. Taejin's body processed the information before his mind could intervene. Hillary watched it happen, the involuntary backward shift of his weight, the color leaving the lower half of his face, the way his hands came slowly out of his pockets with the instinctive, useless gesture of a man whose body is attempting to prepare for a threat his mind is still refusing to classify as real. "You," Taejin began. "The Busan port contracts," Ji-ho said. His voice was still rough, still rebuilt from almost nothing, but it carried with a quiet that somehow reached every corner of the sealed room without effort. He was not projecting. He did not need to. The 3 American distributors. The accounts in the name of a foundation that does not exist. He paused. The decision to sell the Seoul territories to the Manchurian Consortium for 60% of their assessed value, because you needed the liquidity before the end of the financial quarter. Every word landed with the precision of something that had been held in the dark for a very long time, sharpened by weeks of enforced silence into something that cut without raising its voice. "You said all of this," Ji-ho continued, standing at the foot of my bed. 8 weeks ago, on a Tuesday. His eyes had not moved from Taejin's face. "You believed I could not hear you. The sweat appeared on Taejin's forehead in the specific way that fear produces it, not the clean sweat of exertion, but the cold, involuntary sweat of a man whose nervous system has just received information it cannot process without catastrophic structural consequence. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. The bathroom door opened. Jinwoo stepped into the room. He was still moving at approximately 70%, Hillary could read it, in the slight forward lean of his massive frame, the way he favored his left side, but the suppressed weapon in his right hand was completely, professionally steady. And his eyes, as they swept the three men flanking, Taejin communicated a single, unambiguous message. The three men looked at each other. They looked at Jinwoo. They looked at Ji-ho standing in the center of the room like something that had been wrongly buried and had decided, with extreme prejudice, to correct the error. They stepped back. Taejin's composure did not collapse all at once. It came apart in pieces, the shoulders first, dropping a fraction from their habitual elevation, then the jaw, and then finally the eyes, which had always carried that calculated, proprietary coldness, and which now held something Hillary had never expected to see in them: fear. Genuine, foundational, animal fear. Ji-ho! His voice came out wrong. Too thin. Stripped of everything that had made it dangerous. Don't. One word. Delivered so quietly it was almost gentle. Whatever you are about to say, I have already heard the truth. And the truth is significantly more interesting. Jinwoo crossed the room. His hand closed on Taejin's shoulder with the grip of a man who does not intend to be argued with, and Taejin, for the first time in the months of his careful, methodical ascent, had nothing left to say. He was steered toward the sealed doors, which Ji-ho unlocked from the wall panel with a single, unhurried keystroke. The doors opened. Jinwoo's men, 4 of them, Sung-min among them, his face carrying 5 months of accumulated fury held in careful reserve until exactly this moment were waiting in the corridor. Taejin was taken without sound. The doors closed again. The suite returned to silence. Ji-ho stood in the center of it, his back to her, his breathing controlled and deliberate. The effort the last hour had cost him was visible only in the rigid set of his shoulders, the posture of a man holding himself at a height his body was arguing against. Hillary rose from her chair. Her legs were unsteady beneath her dark skin, and she allowed herself exactly 1 moment to feel it before she crossed the room and stopped just behind him, not touching, not speaking, simply present in the way she had learned to be present in that room over 5 months of quiet, accumulated proximity. He turned. His eyes found her face, and whatever he saw there produced in his expression something she had never seen on it before, something unguarded, something that lived beneath the authority and the controlled fury like bedrock beneath disturbed soil. Relief. Exhausted, private, devastating relief. He reached for her hand. His fingers threaded through hers with a deliberateness that was not impulsive, it was chosen, fully and consciously, in the way that a man like Ji-ho chose everything. She felt the warmth of his palm against hers, the slight tremor still running through him, the grip that was firm without being hard, certain without being cruel. Outside the sealed windows, the city continued its cold, indifferent glitter. Inside the room, the dragon stood in the wreckage of the coup that was supposed to bury him, holding the hand of the woman who had sung him back from the dark, and neither of them said a single word. They didn't need to. Some things are understood only in the body. The 72 hours that followed were not hers to account for in any detail she was permitted to keep. Men arrived, men left, calls were made in Korean in rooms she was not invited into, and the estate reorganized itself around its returned center of gravity with the quiet, efficient speed of an organization that had been waiting for exactly this signal. She understood that an empire was being reconstructed around her. She simply had no designated place inside it, not yet. 3 days after the coup collapsed, the estate smelled different. It was the first thing Hillary noticed before the new guard rotations, before the quiet, efficient disappearance of Taejin's men from the corridors, before the physicians were replaced by a private medical team flown in from Seoul whose credentials were impeccable and whose discretion was absolute. Before all of it, she noticed the smell. The heavy, clinging residue of cigarette smoke and manufactured cologne, and the particular staleness of men operating on borrowed authority, all of it gone, replaced by something cleaner, colder. The estate breathing differently now that the thing contaminating its air had been removed. Jiho moved through his reclaimed kingdom the way water finds its level, not dramatically, not with any visible exertion, but with the patient, inevitable certainty of something returning to the only place it had ever truly belonged. She watched him from a careful distance in those first days, watched him receive his lieutenants in the study with the reinforced windows, watched the calls, the meetings, the controlled and methodical reconstruction of an empire that had been deliberately fractured. He moved through all of it with a stillness that generated gravity, rather than absorbing it, the stillness of a man who has returned from somewhere unreachable and is quietly, permanently, recalibrated by the journey. Everyone in the estate felt it. Everyone adjusted accordingly, including Hillary, who had been trying, with very limited success, to determine what her role was now that the role she had arrived with no longer existed. He asked her to come to the study on the fourth evening. She knocked. He told her to enter. She opened the door and found him behind the desk, dressed for the first time in something other than the medical garments of his recovery. A dark shirt with the collar open, the tattoos at his throat visible, his posture carrying the easy, anchored authority of a man fully reoccupying his own body. He looked, Hillary thought with a clarity that she immediately set aside, exactly like what he was. On the desk between them sat a briefcase. Black, unbranded, closed. "Sit down," he said, not unkindly. She sat. She looked at the briefcase and then at his face and found him already watching her with those dark, unreadable eyes, the eyes she had studied for 5 months in stillness and had spent the last 3 days learning to read in motion. She had discovered that they were more transparent than she had expected from a man of his construction, not readable to everyone. But to her, after 5 months of tending to the face those eyes lived in, they had developed a grammar she could follow. He was not comfortable. That was the first thing she read. He pushed the briefcase across the desk toward her. "Open it," he said. She did. The smell reached her before the sight did that crisp, mineral scent of new currency in large denominations, clean and faintly intoxicating. The bills were banded, stacked with geometric precision, filling the case to its capacity. Beside the money, a sealed envelope. Inside the envelope, she knew without opening it, would be documents. A new name, a new history, a life constructed from clean materials, unburdened by anything that had happened in this estate or the room at the end of its east corridor. Jiho's voice, when it came, was level, careful. The voice of a man who has rehearsed what he intends to say and is delivering it with precision. "You saved my life," he said. "Twice, by my count. Possibly more, depending on how you measure what a voice can do for a man in the dark." He paused. "This is yours. The documents will hold under any international scrutiny. You can go anywhere, build anything. No one from my world will ever find you, and no one will ever ask you to carry something like this again." Hillary looked at the money. She looked at it for a long time. She thought about the debt, the generational, crushing, ever-present debt that had narrowed every room she had ever walked into. She thought about what those bills would mean, what it would feel like to set it all down, to walk out of the estate and into an ordinary street in an ordinary city and belong entirely to herself, unburdened, unencumbered, answerable to no one. She thought about a wet November night and a song she had sung to an empty room. She thought about a jaw tightening in the dark, a hand closing around hers. A ruined voice, delivering her own melody back to her from somewhere so deep and so private that receiving it had felt less like being heard and more like being found. She closed the briefcase. She pushed it back across the desk. "No," she said. The word was quiet. It did not waver. Jiho went very still with the dense, charged quality of a man absorbing something he did not expect to feel. something that bypassed every layer of armor he had spent a lifetime constructing, and arrived, unannounced, at the thing beneath. His eyes moved across her face with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable to receive. Searching for something, finding it, and then doing something she had not yet seen his face do in all the days since his awakening. It broke open, just slightly, just enough. The controlled architecture of his expression, the composure that had been load-bearing for so long it had probably forgotten it was a choice, developed a single, visible fracture. His jaw shifted. His eyes dropped briefly to the closed briefcase between them, then returned to her face, and what lived in them now was not the burning, calculated fury she had seen when he stepped from the curtains, not the fierce, concentrated effort of his resurrection. It was something quieter than any of that, and more dangerous. He rose from the desk. He came around it without hurry, without performance. With the same deliberate economy of movement she had watched him apply to everything since his return, as though each action was consciously chosen rather than reflexive, as though he had come back from the dark with a revised understanding of what deserved his intention. He stopped in front of her chair. He reached down, and his thumb, careful, unhurried, traced the line of her cheekbone, and she understood only when she felt the warmth of the touch that she had been crying. She had not noticed. She noticed now. She rose. They stood very close. The study was quiet around them, the city a cold glitter beyond the reinforced glass, the empire humming its reconstruction in distant rooms, and between them, the compressed, accumulated gravity of 5 months of proximity and survival, and something that had grown in the dark between a man who could not speak and a woman who had spoken anyway, something neither of them had named yet, because naming it would have made it possible to refuse. Jiho's arms came around her, not tentatively, fully, completely, with the certain and possessive warmth of a man who has made a decision he does not intend to revisit. He pulled her in until there was no remaining distance between them, and he buried his face in the curve of her neck, and she felt him exhale against her skin long and slow and utterly, privately undone the breath of a man finally setting down something that had been very, very heavy for a very, very long time. Her arms found him. Her dark hands pressed flat against his back, feeling the warmth of him, the solidity of him, the faint and fading tremor of a body still completing its long return to itself. His lips moved against her neck, not a kiss words. Delivered so quietly they existed only in the contact point of his mouth against her skin. "The voice that kept me alive in the dark," he said, "will be the only voice that tells me how to live in the light." A pause, breath warm against her collarbone. "Whatever I build from here, whatever this empire becomes, it will answer to you. Only you." Hillary closed her eyes. Outside, the city moved through its cold and indifferent rhythms, entirely unaware that in a study on the 4th floor of a fortified American estate, the most feared man in the soul underworld had just handed the only real power he possessed to a girl in a black and white uniform who had once sung to him because the silence was too loud. She had come here to pay off a debt. She had not expected to acquire something so much more complicated, so much more irreversible in its place. But she held him tighter, and she did not let go. If Jiho and Hillary's story pulled you under and kept you there, you already know there is no coming back from a love built in the dark. The underworld is vast, and the next story is already waiting in the shadows. Subscribe now, leave a review, and tell us who you want to meet next. The Mafia Boss romance series continues, where loyalty is the only currency that matters, and desire is the most dangerous weapon of all. Click the link in the description. The next chapter of the Empire begins now.